Okay, so good afternoon to all respected faculty and eminent speakers from all worldwide. It's definitely an honor to be representing as an oral speaker at this international platform noted as Japan International Conference on Carbon Materials and Nanotechnology. My name is Santosh Kumar Miryala, currently a master's student at University of Oxford in the Nuffield Division of Medical Sciences. And today my talk will definitely focus on the topic of investigating the field dependence of critical current densities in high temperature superconductors. And that can vary from materials such as MgB2 or GD123. So going on, my presentation will solely focus on multiple key areas, and it may also include on the current applications of superconductivity, the development of bulk MgB2, and the design and development of prototype maglev, and more importantly, analyzing the critical current density and the modeling behavior of various bulk superconductors, and moreover going towards its summary. So mainly the question which revolves around the world is, why MgB2? There are many scientists working on MgB2. Even if you look at today's conference materials, many professors are stressing the importance of the MgB2 material. So the question might be, what is the speciality? Well, that might be due to its very high TC, also its very simple crystal structure, large coherence length, high critical current densities, and also one can also note that transparency of grain boundaries to current promises that shows that MgB2 material are really promising materials for large scale applications. And those kind of applications are very interesting because, as you can see, it can be divided into numerous components such as MRI healthcare. And it's important to note that it can be sprouted in different areas. For instance, if you look at the medical field, it can be not only MRI, but it also makes a big impact in drug delivery system or NMR, because the biggest application for superconductivity in producing the large volume, stable, high intensity magnetic fields it's a quality that is required only by the MRI and NMR. And it had produced a multi-billion market in the United States for numerous companies, such as Oxford Instruments or Siemens. And also, like, for example, looking in Japan, magnetic levitation is such a significant factor where superconductors perform extremely well in terms of transport vehicles. And, and its phenomenal property of flowing and eliminating friction is definitely a factor which we might have to think about when it might transform the transportation sector. So going on, like, I would like to go more towards my research right now. So I would like to start it off by discussing what are the main prospects of making them bulk MgB2 samples. So bulk MgB2 samples were somewhat fabricated using the C2 solid state reaction method. And Furichi Chemical Corporation had provided us with the purified powders of amorphous B, which were 99% impurity. And also Mg metallic powder was also needed, which was also in 99% purity. So these high purified powders were mixed in a stoichiometric ratio of 1 to 2 when it comes to Mg to B. And also a sterilized metallic Ag was added to MgB2 powder mixtures in an amount of 0%, 4%, and 10%. And each resultant powder mixture was thoroughly grinded in a setting of glove box in argon atmosphere. It is also important to note that the uniaxial pressing machine was utilized to compress the powder mixture into pellets within the dimensions of, I believe, 7 millimeters width to 20 millimeters in diameter. And after all of these pellets were wrapped into a tantalum foils and were heated under argon atmosphere, and that it was tubed up into a sintering temperature of around 775 degrees. Eventually, the temperature was reduced to room temperature with a cooling rate of 100 degrees per hour. And after producing the sample, it was necessary to analyze the samples in various methodologies, whether it be scanning electron microscope, and also chemical compositions were analyzed by EDX and so on. And this was basically the program sequence that was utilized to produce the MgB2 samples. So going on, it is very important to study the superconducting transition for silver-free and silver-added MgB2 material. So the magnetization data was collected within the range of 15 Kelvin and 50 Kelvin using a squid magnetometer. And as you can see from the figure pointed out in my slide, the temperature dependence of the DC susceptibility in the zero field cooled process magnetic field was around like 1 MT. And both silver-free and silver-added MgB2 samples were centered in a 775 degrees Argon temperature as I had expressed further. So as you can analyze from this graph, this is like the TC susceptibility data, which I was able to obtain through SQUID. And you know, in order to further process this data, it is very important to also estimate the JC values by using the extended Bean's critical current density formula, because this is a formula which looks for the rectangular isotropic sample, and it is given by this equation where D is the thickness of the sample, A and B would be the transverse dimensions of the sample, and that is where B should be greater than A. And then delta M was pretty much the difference in the magnetic moments on the descending and the ascending branch of the MH loops. And as you can analyze from this critical current density graph, which I had plotted over here, the 4% AG samples were somewhat like 30% higher when compared to AG-free material during the phase of 1.5 Tesla. Furthermore, one can also note that the JC value was around 292 kiloamps per centimeter squared. So comparing like all other samples, the 4% sample showed the best results. And that is because when the sample was prepared by analysis, it can note that AgNO3 particles were formulated, and that led to the increase in the critical current density. So it's also important to note that a famous scientist noted as Jirsa et al. Had proposed a formula that enables us to fit the magnetic data and associated critical current density by using the equation that was explained over there. And then like modeling the critical current density is very important from a science perspective because it gives us a strong comprehension of the flux spinning mechanisms, and that is very important to improve the material's further performance. And Perkinson's et al. Had proposed this model to fit the secondary peak on the critical current density as a function of the magnetic field. So from this, you can note that JC1 is the remnant critical current density, and B stands for the applied magnetic field, and B0 is one of the parameters over there, and that is a fitting constant that signifies how fast the peak is decaying within the increasing magnetic field. So this is one example. The experiment data was nicely fitted for MgB2 material with equation 1, and this was the best fit model which I was able to investigate. But while creating these models, there were certain parameters which will have to be kept in mind because we need to take into account of the coherence length, and also the vortex core size in MgB2 are 20 times larger than compared to cuprates. So it means that there will be relevant defects that will be much larger and can be highly regarded as point-like defects, and these are responsible for the secondary peak in the cuprates. So also another point which I wanted to point out from this graph is that in MgB2, only large defects are really effective, and these are known to contribute to the central maximum. So due to this following reason, there was only one equation used to fit, but when we were fitting the experimental curve, we need to consider rather a broad peak at a zero magnetic field because it's impossible to utilize a pure exponential decay with an exact experimental maximum that was used for JC1, and instead maybe a higher JC values are needed. So in order to fit by pure exponential decay, we'll have to skip the first 6 to 8 points, 6 to 8 experimental points for a proper fit. So this was also the 4% curve. As you can see, it was nicely fitted. So these were the strategies which were utilized for modeling the thermal activated flux motion of the MgV2 superconductors with, as I would say, with silver addition and without silver addition. And now, after like looking at the models of MgV2, it comes into curiosity, how does it also matter for other samples, whether it be GD123 or ER123? So that's the further investigation which I wanted to go into. And one of the primary applications of GD123 materials is that in Japan, RTRI is one of the main developers of the Japanese maglev trains, which has revolutionized the transportation sector. And it's very interesting news to note that in the year of 2025, we can expect Tokyo to Nagoya to Osaka, we can establish like a maglev train. But I believe these are ran by liquid helium. So after like looking at this news, I came up to a question of why can I not like develop my own prototype of the maglev train, and instead of running it with liquid helium, why not liquid nitrogen? Because liquid nitrogen is much more easier to utilize, and it's much more cost effective and easy to be utilized, I guess. So this is like the superconducting train construction and the modeling procedure. So as you can see from the construction and the operation of the prototype of the high TC superconductor train can be made with these items. And I guess in this investigation, I had tried my best to levitate a model train by using a melt process GD123 superconducting material over a magnetic rail. And in order to produce an oval shaped track, it has to be in an SNS configuration, which is arranged on an iron plate. And the train bodies were constructed by utilizing FRP sheets, and they were further formed to maintain the temperature of the liquid nitrogen. And by using the field cool mechanism on the magnetic track, which will provide us large stability of the levitation due to extremely strong flux spinning of the melt process superconductors. And this setup enables us to test parameters such as stability, safety, speed, and what is the best optimum gap for the superconducting train to run from maybe, for instance, from a 1 millimeter to 15 millimeter gap. And these are such important mechanisms or parameters which we have to analyze because these are the long-term applications. And in order to conduct and implement these long-term applications, we'll have to look into different parameters. So as you can see from my next slide, like levitation principles were tested by utilizing various gaps, and that it is clearly indicated that experimental results had shown that the trains with 1 to 2 millimeters gaps cannot run properly because there was some certain friction that was applied between the track. So from that investigation, our results strongly confirmed that 5 millimeter gap was the optimum distance in order for maglev trains to run successfully with nicer stability on a fast track. And these present results clearly show that the stability of the superconducting train, it highly depends on the gap that was posed between the rail and the train. So it's definitely a very important parameter which will have to be analyzed and looked into, because these are the small steps which will be needed in order to impose or implement maglev trains for large-scale applications within the world. And as you can see next, that when we were operating maglev trains from maybe either 10 to 50 millimeters, it was not the best because the gap was way too big and the stability and safety of the train to run was not functioning well. So it was clearly indicated that it was not able to run properly on the track. And as a conclusion, 5 millimeter gap was an optimum gap. And not only qualitative analysis, but quantitative analysis was also utilized by looking at the speed. And as you can see, 5 millimeter had the best speed compared to 1 millimeter and 3 millimeter, because 1 to 3 was such a small gap and friction was applied. And we had trials where the train was not able to go all around the track. And 7 to 15 millimeters, the gap was very big that trains had derailed, and it had due to the decrease in stability and safety. And now, this is like going back to my modeling studies. So similarly as how I had modeled the samples for MGB2, I also came to curiosity of what are the mechanisms which will have to be taken in order to model GD123 samples. And from this graph, it is clearly noted that the GD123 samples, the magnetic moment somewhat exhibits more than one feature at its intermediate fields. So we can say that we can actually analyze a second peak, and that the magnetic moment over there increases with an increased magnetic field and somewhat decreases thereafter. So when we look into bulk high TC superconductors, usually at a second peak, or at least at the shoulder, appears to be at the during the experimental curve at intermediate fields. So modeling of this peak will require a combination, or more importantly, an integration of two functions where one peak is increasing, another one is decreasing with field. So it's very important to combine two functions into one when we're looking at these kind of case scenarios. So the following formula, which I will show, will fulfill these requirements, because as I had indicated in this is the equation above, A2 is basically the general height of the second peak. And the more separated the peak from the first one, the closer that is for the A2 value to be closer to the second peak. So in practice, A2 value will always be a bit lower, but the peak height will be somewhat good compared to the first choice. And BM value represents the position of the second peak, or sometimes the shoulder on the experimental curve, from the measured data which we had obtained. And it is important to note that the n value is again like a fitting constant, and it will be in between the value of 1 and the value of 3. But in most cases from the past studies from literature, it will always be somewhere near 2. So as you can see, like when I meant by the integration of two functions, one is going down and one is going up. So in order to fit GD123 samples, it is so important to integrate those two functions. And as you can see, after the combination of equation 2 and equation 3, we can see a nice fit. And over here, we can see how n values were varied from 1 to 1.5. And it is so important to note that modeling is usually done by the means of commercial fitting program, but it can also be done by hand, but not very precisely. So so from the figures which I had showed before, and even right now, it illustrates how variation of one of the parameters of n will affect the curve shape overall. So lastly, this is the summary of the work. So from the slides which I had shown you, the critical current density of MGB2 was tested at 20 Kelvin by using the magnetization experiments of squid. And by using the proposed model by Jisha et al., I was able to perfectly fit the models for MGB2 or GD123. And another takeaway message, which is very important to note about superconducting materials in the long-term goals, is that, for example, right now we're going through such a devastating process of COVID-19 pandemic, and no one had ever expected that we'll be going into a pandemic right now. And many people might believe that the future is all about AI, and the future is all about robots, but it is important for the human race. It's important for the human race and for our generations to be prepared for the unspoken challenges such as global warming. And in order to tackle global warming, it is so important to think as a scientist that superconducting materials can revolutionize when we are counteracting such global issues and with an attainment of sustainable developmental goals. So that's one of the main message which I wanted to bring out. And thank you very much for your kind patience and listening throughout my talk. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Santosh. Um, any questions?
Yes, I have two short questions, please.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, okay, Prof. Yeah.
But first, thank you, congratulations, Santosh, for this nice talk, and also the thermal activation motion model where you also share with us. That was quite interesting.
Thank you,
I would
sir.
just like to know about now the silver addition. You
Yeah.
use the silver oxide. Why you didn't use the metallic silver?
I use silver oxide because that's one of like the curiosity points which I had used, because after reading so much literature, no one had modeled by using the silver oxide, and metallic silver compounds were already modeled in previous literature. So like thinking from that perspective, I thought it's very important to find this new data and finding these new models, which will create a progression in science, because it's always very important to fill the gaps in literature. So that's one of the main reasons I looked into that perspective.
Okay. Well, now regarding my second question is about the maglev, the one where we
Yes,
do in the lab. You show that 5 millimeter gap was quite was like optimum where you obtain a very good speed. My
yes.
question to know how was this speed in the lab level?
In where?
The speed here. Do you also able to record or not?
Yes, yes. So this is the graph where I was able to record. It was two
Yeah.
seconds, 2 seconds, 2 seconds, and less than 1 second. And as you can see, this is such an important factor, because if you look at 1 millimeter, like the trials were not even completed because of such a minimal gap, and because of the friction, the trains would just stop over there. And if you look from 7 to 15 millimeters, it was just impossible to conduct those trials, because due to zero stability, the trains would just fall out. So so that's a very nice question. So in terms of speed, it was all 2 seconds, and also maybe sometimes less than 1 second. And this was somewhat evaluated by using there was a compression pressure which would push that train. So that was a control variable which was utilized.
Yeah.
So this is somewhat the numerical value which I was able to obtain in terms of speed.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.